My name is Bart Ziegler, the president of the Samuel Arts Foundation. Our role here is to collaborate through science, art, and education to find solutions for our planet's greatest challenges, from nuclear safety to climate change. And today's panel will specifically address nuclear wastewater dumping into the ocean, as well as the impact that radioactive byproducts from nuclear power can have on the environment. We are just privileged to have one of the greatest panels. I'll turn this over to our moderator, Lance Gould, the CEO of Brooklyn Story Lab and former executive editor of the Huffington Post, to moderate today's discussion and to introduce our truly brilliant panel of speakers. Thank you, Lance.
Thank you, Bart, so much, and welcome to all. 2 months ago, Japan dumped 250,000 gallons of radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima area's compromised nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean. That plant was badly damaged, many should recall, in a 2011 earthquake and ensuing tsunami. Just yesterday, Japan dumped another 250,000 gallons into the Pacific, or began the process of doing such. This is a course they are planning to follow for the next 30 years. But the radioactivity of this amount of wastewater will be dangerous for thousands of years. Today, we're going to talk about this developing situation, not from a geopolitical perspective, though we should note that Japan's neighbors, like South Korea and China, are enraged over this decision, but from a scientific perspective. We have two scientists on our panel today, both with expertise on matters related to radioactive impact on ecosystems. First, we have Dr. Bob Richmond, a research professor at the University of Hawaii and director of the University of Hawaii's Kewalo Marine Laboratory. His research includes coral reef ecology, marine conservation biology, exotoxicology, and climate change. And he was recently one of 5 independent experts on nuclear issues selected by the Pacific Islands Forum to more closely examine Japan's response to the Fukushima disaster. And in just February, he was in Fukushima to make an assessment. He's joining us today from Norway, where he's at a convening of the Pew Fellows in Marine Conservation. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks very much, Lance. Real pleasure to be here.
And we also have very, very pleased to have Dr. Tim Mousseau, professor of biological sciences at the University of South Carolina, Columbia. He is also the director and co-founder of the Chernobyl and Fukushima Research Initiative, a multinational research collaborative aimed at studying the biological effects of radioactive pollutants resulting from nuclear accidents, atomic bomb tests, and nuclear power plants. He was the first U.S.-based biologist to conduct research in Fukushima starting in July 2011, and he's authored or co-authored more than 130 scientific papers related to Chernobyl or Fukushima studies. So welcome, Tim.
Thanks very much, Lance. Pleasure to be here.
I think we have the right team here today to talk about Fukushima, so glad you're both here. First question, this is happening right now. Just yesterday, as we mentioned, another 250,000 gallons of contaminated wastewater was released or depending on your perspective, dumped into the Pacific. Neighboring countries are outraged, Pacific Islanders are concerned, environmentalists are worried, and if this plant continues unabated, millions of gallons will be dumped into the world's largest ocean over 3 decades. So first question, Bob, can you tell us about the process for addressing nuclear emergencies? Why is there so much water? What was the water used for in the process of bringing Fukushima under control? Where was it collected? And what has Japan been doing with that water for the last 12 years?
Sure. So just to bring people up to speed a little bit, you mentioned 2011, there was a major earthquake off of the Japan coast that caused a 15-meter, 45-foot tsunami wave that inundated the area. And if you simply Google, was Fukushima preventable? 2 papers will pop to the very top, one by the Carnegie Institute, a non-political think tank, and another very well done peer-reviewed paper. TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, is the operator of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And they were warned in 2007 that they were not up to the safety standards that would be required. That was actually the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. Their own scientists had warned them that they could expect this 15-meter wave, and that's exactly what happened. And their safety protocols were poor and just unacceptable. It's what we call in science pseudo-replication, meaning their backups were not really backups at all. Anything like a 15-meter tsunami wave that took out the power plants, would take out the backup generators and the backup pumps and all the communication. That's exactly what happened. So the fact is we're here and you can't go back, but it never should have occurred in the first place. What happened was the power plants got knocked out. In order for the cores to remain at a reasonable temperature, cooling water is circulated around it. In a normally operating power plant, is through heat exchangers, so there's no direct contact with cooling water and the actual core. It's done in an exchange way. What we call tritium or tritiated water is a byproduct, but there's a big difference when you hear things about, well, a lot of power plants release tritium into the water. Argument number one for me is just because other people behave badly is no excuse for me to behave badly. But number two, there's a huge difference between what's going on in Fukushima and normally operating nuclear power plant. And I'm sure Tim can wax poetic about this as well. And so what is happening then is every day about 100 tons of additional groundwater, contaminated groundwater, are formed. And they've been stored in these very large tanks that are in the Fukushima plant area. Each of these tanks is huge. Each one, there are about 1,000 tanks right now with 1.3 million tons of contaminated water, about 62 different radionuclides. And this is continuing to form. It's interesting that a lot of the focus you hear right now is on the release of what's called the treated, ALPS treated, meaning Advanced Liquid Processing System, is a way of treating the water. It removes nominally most other radionuclides, but it can't remove tritium the way it's configured, nor carbon-14. And just to give you an idea, chemically, tritium has a half-life of 12.3 years, carbon-14, 5,730 years. So this is a concern. As Lance mentioned, was said the release is supposed to go on for over 30 years. And that's intergenerational, meaning it's my generation, my daughter's generation, and any grandkids that might come along. And in addition, it's what we call transboundary, meaning the water is not going to stay in Japan's coastal waters. It will make its way across through both ocean currents and through fish. And we know for a fact that in 2011, the year that the disaster occurred, tuna caught off of San Diego on the other side of the Pacific were in fact found with radioactive cesium-137 that could be signatured back to the Fukushima power plant disaster. The levels were very low, so I want to make sure we're talking responsibly. But in essence, this is what's going on. The collection of the water still being formed from the groundwater, and the concern that Japan is saying is that they are running out of room, which is not really the fact. But there is alternative ways of handling it other than dumping it in the ocean. And I'll go ahead and stop there.
And because all oceans are connected, of course, to your point, that's transboundary. I mean, any impact on the water off the coast of Japan could impact any area in the world. But to your point about other ways to have prevented this scenario, and given the volume of contaminated wastewater collected, is there any other solution for what to do with it other than dumping it into the ocean?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, it's one thing to say, no, don't do something. But it's very important to come up with a constructive alternative. I'm, as mentioned, one of the 5 members of the expert panel that's been advising the Pacific Island Forum. For those of you not aware of who they are, it's 18 Pacific nations, 16 island nations populated by indigenous people, plus Australia and New Zealand. And so you have 18 nations that are very concerned about it, as they should be. The Pacific is, in fact, one basin. And I do a lot of work with traditional navigators and traditional island practitioners. And what they often say is the oceans don't separate the islands, they connect the islands. And that's what's really important. They're connected through ocean currents, they're connected through organisms, and unfortunately, they're connected through plastics. And so for this reason, anything that goes into the ocean in Fukushima will in fact be distributed throughout the Pacific through physical and biological processes. So we looked at the amount of water that's there. This plan to release it for over 30 years. Our calculations are showing maybe it'll be as high as 40. If they were to use that same water to make concrete to be used on site, and as mentioned, I was there last February, and one thing was very striking to me. They need to pour a lot of concrete. Number one, they need to build a seawall to the height it should have been in the initial phase, which is 45 feet or higher. Number two, there's an ice barrier underground to try to limit the amount of groundwater that's seeping into reactors 1, 2, and 3 that are in meltdown. And there's leakage there that should definitely be replaced with a concrete barrier rather than the ice barrier that's there. And there are also these huge 1 cubic yard bags of radioactive contaminated soil distributed around the site that was bulldozed up, and they're just staying in stacks. And if a typhoon were to hit Japan, which happens quite often, all that soil is going to end up in the ocean. So that really needs to be stabilized, and concrete bunkers would be good. If they go with a concrete option, number one, it takes away the transboundary issue because it's fixed on site. Number two, it takes away the biological uptake because it'll all be bound up in the concrete. And many of the radionuclides, when we talk about ionizing radiation or radioactivity, gamma rays are the high energy ones that kind of shoot through things. Beta are particles. And so the penetration of a beta particle in concrete is about 5/10 of a micron, and therefore it's not going anywhere. And because tritium, which is one of the radionuclides that can't be removed, but not necessarily the radionuclide of greatest concern, after 50 years, which is the engineering half-life for concrete, you will have gone through 4 half-lives of 12.3 years, and you'll be down to about 6% of the original ionizing radiation. So it removes the biological impact, it removes the transboundary issues, it fixes it on site, and it makes it basically non-available for causing damage elsewhere. When we raised this with the Japanese government and the people at TEPCO, they kind of shook their heads, said, yeah, we've considered, but we don't want to do it. And when we kept pushing them, saying, well, if you're guaranteeing that the water is totally safe, why are you so adverse to keeping it on site? Because nobody's going to be doing anything at Fukushima for quite a while. And we got a number of very non-compelling responses to that, which we can discuss later. But yeah, there is a much better alternative, which is concrete. We actually have a paper on it, an 8-pager, if anyone's interested. One of the people on our committee is a nuclear physicist with an engineering background, and it's a solid paper that indicates there is an alternative to the ocean dumping.
It's reassuring to know at least that there is a possibility, although not so reassuring that it's not being taken advantage of. Tim, let me move to you. Is the dumping of this water advised? What kind of safety concerns, composition of this contaminated water, and the impact it could have on marine life, the environment, and people?
So, I just want to start by seconding most of Bob's comments there. They're right on the mark. There has to be alternatives. At this point in time, clearly we really have no idea what the long-term ecological consequences will be of the tritium that's definitely going to be released, the carbon-14 that's going to be released, and the whole plethora of other radionuclides that will be released to varying degrees along with the water. And given that there have been no comprehensive analyses of the potential for, say, bioaccumulation of these different radionuclides into the food chain, and so bioaccumulation is when an organism will, accumulate the radionuclide as it lives. Biomagnification is what happens when a given contaminant actually increases in concentration as it goes up the food chain. Other examples of this process include mercury, that is a lot of it comes from the burning of coal, for instance, and it gets into the ocean ecosystem and bioaccumulates up the food chain into the top predatory fish. DDT was the classic example that spawned the whole Silent Spring Rachel Carson movement that basically led to the banning of DDT use in most parts of the world because of its negative impacts on the ecosystem. So, given this complete ignorance concerning the potential long-term ecological consequences, it's absolutely, imperative that this dumping be stopped at least until such basic fundamental ecological questions can be addressed.
Thank you, Tim. And can you give one example? Bob mentioned tuna that was being found containing, I believe he said cesium or strontium. Can you give us an example just to help paint the picture for us of what the impact could be, just at first locally in Japan or somewhere else in the marine ecosystem, just to help us more vividly imagine like the negative impact?
Well, the simplest potential consequences is that, the tritium, for instance, becomes bound to organic material in the water column, the phytoplankton, and converted from a what we call an HTO, or a waterborne tritium, as opposed to an organically bound one. But once it's become incorporated into biochemicals inside the organism, that provides the opportunity for it to accumulate inside the body of individual organisms. And the longer the organism lives, the more it can accumulate. And so if some of the worms, say, in the sediment, or the zooplankton that are feeding on the phytoplankton, start eating this contaminated phytoplankton, then the levels of tritium inside their body might go up significantly. And then you have
so the nightmare scenario would be then, just interpreting what you're saying, is that it becomes system-wide. All the microorganisms fed upon by all the larger organisms, and everything that's living in the ocean is suddenly contaminated because of this system-wide shutdown or system-wide corruption.
Well, I don't think I'd go that far, but locally, within the region where the contamination is significant, there's the potential for it to increase in concentration up the food chain, such that the top predators, like the fish that people eat, for instance, would have levels way above regulatory limits, way above what we might consider safe levels. And so there's been one paper that has demonstrated that this is a possibility for tritium. And unfortunately, there haven't been any others. And clearly, this is an area that needs to be addressed. This one paper was very rigorously done. It was a very well done piece of science. And so it should give us pause before we continue with this dumping process.
Well, speaking of very good science, Bob, you experienced the opposite. When we spoke earlier, you mentioned that when we spoke earlier before the program, you mentioned that on your visit to Fukushima, you witnessed back in February what you described as poorly designed and performed science as proof that the impact of the contaminated water would be minimal. Can you relate what you witnessed in Japan in February?
I certainly want to support everything Tim just said. He nailed it. Here we have an ocean that, if it was a sterile aquarium, these calculations of saying that the solution of pollution is dilution is what we often hear, would be the calculated case, but it's not that case at all because of everything Tim said. You have everything from microorganisms and molecules up to the ecosystem level, and each link or each part of this food web is an opportunity for uptake, what we call trophic transfer from one organism to another, and for bioaccumulation. And so one of the questions that we asked, and Tim nailed it again, we're both scientists and we're data driven. We don't go into this with any preconceived notion other than to say, show us the data. And the five of us on the panel from the very beginning said, we're not going in with an assumption that, there's evil intent or bad activities or bad designs. We want to see the data. And that's been what's concerning to us, is your outputs are only as good as the quality of the work that you do. And so one of the issues to deal with what Tim mentioned about the uptake, especially of things like tritium, is to set up an experiment. And like it or not, the experiment is already established. We have 3 reactors in meltdown and the water that's contaminated. And so we said, if you're going to be doing indicator organisms, you should have a filter feeding organism. And so when we asked them about that, they picked a bottom fish, an algae, and a crab. And we go, well, those are okay, and they're representative of things you'd find in the ocean. But what you really want to have is a filter feeding organism, like an oyster. Those are the perfect ones. And as Tim said, tritium, hydrogen, and carbon-14 are both taken up by phytoplankton very easily. I've done experiments using carbon-14 as a marker to be able to get it taken up during photosynthesis in corals. That's a symbiosis with an alga. And that's how we measure the movement of energy from the algae that are symbiotic to the host. And so when we said, what about the bivalve? And they said, well, we chose these other animals because they're easy to raise. And Japan is the number one producer in the world of an oyster called Crossostria japonicus. The reason it's called japonicus, it's all over the Japan coast. And so my recommendation is go ahead and put phytoplankton in some of the tritiated water, then feed them to the bivalve. They'll be taken up. The bivalves are particularly good for these kinds of things. They're not only filter feeders for particulate matter of the phytoplankton, but because they make a shell that's made of calcium, they're very good. If there's strontium 90 in the water, they'll pick it up and incorporate the strontium into the shell. So it's another good way of doing it. And so they indicated, no, they weren't going to do anything with filter feeding organisms. The document is they're touting as the science to prove that this is safe is called an REIA, Radiological Environmental Impact Assessment. And it's a very poorly developed plan. It's insufficient in many cases. Assumptions in the science are not supported. They're incorrect. And there are so many data gaps in there that they're not answering the key questions. So I said, all right, let's look at the experiment you have, which was the bottom fish experiment. And they have a fiberglass tank with bottom fish in it, into which they put the tritiated water, and then have a video camera that people can look and say, well, the fish aren't dead. And so in the world of ecotoxicology that I do and the work that Tim does, we say death is a rather crude estimator of stress. Things don't have to die in order for them to have a problem. And so we have all of these very elegant techniques that we develop to look at stressors at the sublethal level to see what's going on. And so a lot of the work I do is in the area of what we call proteomics, looking at proteins that are very diagnostic. We affectionately call it Dr. Doodle meets CSI, where we can actually listen to animals. You know, Dr. Doodle will talk to animals. I say I talk to my dog all the time and it makes no difference. But what we can do with these techniques is listen to the animals, what's stressing them. And we mooch these techniques from human medicine, the same proteins that a doctor would analyze in a blood sample. If you were having a toxic reaction to a new medication, they're looking at your liver proteins or liver enzymes. If they're elevated, it means you're having a toxic reaction. We look for the same exact things in corals, or in corals and in fish and marine organisms. And these are very, very good indicators. We look for oxidative stress. We look for detoxification. And so we asked, where are these tests that you should be able to do to identify stress at the sublethal level? We're not looking for fish to die. That's not what's going to happen. If they are dying, everybody better get out of the building really quick. That's not the level of radiation you want anyone to be around. And so
I'm going to stop you there, Bob, just because I want to make sure we have time for all of the other questions and for questions from the audience. But that is, in summary, you were incredibly disappointed by the science that was going into the reasoning and rationale for what they're doing, and that should be very alarming for all of us. Tim,
I'll just
study.
finish this real quick though. Just people need to understand why it's bad. That because what Tim said of the trophic interactions, the proper way to set it up is to put sediment in the tank and then put worms and snails and crabs in the sediment, and they're getting the tritiated water and doing exactly what Tim said. They'll take it up, they'll accumulate it, then it'll go into the fish. That's the way in which it becomes a problem of organically bound tritium, is through trophic, taking it up into the liver typically. What they're doing, you could replicate with a kitchen sponge. You put it in the tritiated water, it equilibrates, you put it in clean water, it goes out. And it's a totally farcical study that does not answer the fundamental question that Tim asked.
You need to recreate in some microcosm the ecosystem that we're looking at to see what the impact would be.
Yeah, and the food as well. When I asked them whether they're feeding it, they said commercial aquaculture pellets. So I said, well, are you treating the aquaculture pellets with the tritiated water? They said, no, we just put them in there. And so there is no trophic transfer. There's a big difference between even drinking tritiated water, which I wouldn't recommend, but you can. But if you're taking it up through the food, it's what Tim had mentioned. There's a huge difference between the external exposure to the tritiated water and beta emitters versus internal exposure, where your cells are being exposed and it affects your DNA, your RNA, and critical proteins that are telling your body what to do and when to do it.
Got it. Thank you for that, Bob. And I want to remind the audience that occasionally you'll see a QR code flash up, and there it is right there. and you can utilize that to sign up for the Samuel Lawrence Foundation newsletter and stay informed about this topic with more information. Meanwhile, Tim, you've studied not only Fukushima, but also Chernobyl, test sites in the Pacific, such as the Marshall Islands and many other radiation nuclear accident zones. First, can you tell us from your research of Fukushima and the disaster there, what stands out to you in terms of long-term impact on species, in terms of impact on the food chain, and things of that nature? What is most concerning to you about Fukushima from your research?
Well, I'd like to just, pull back just a second, just a little bit, and continue on the theme that Bob started there. And that is that, the surveillance that's necessary is to actually see what the organisms that are living in the actual environment are experiencing and how they're affected. One of the outcomes from work in Chernobyl, for instance, where we've been working for over 20 years, looking at everything from microbes to moose and humans, in fact. But one of the main generalizations to come from the body of research that's accumulated over the past 30 years is that the effects of these radionuclides are much larger when experienced in nature by the organisms that are living there. Because of all of the other stressors that are involved in just living, it really makes it a much more sensitive and realistic way to assess the consequences. And there are many, many, many very sensitive methods to investigate what those consequences are. For instance, let's just start with, the DNA. Let's look at the genetic consequences. We know that all radionuclides, including tritium, are mutagens. They cause damage to the DNA. And in fact, we just finished a review of tritium where we looked at, we started with 700,000 publications on the topic and narrowed it down to about 450 that sort of address some aspect of the biology of organisms in response. And the basic, the basic message is that, yes, tritium is mutagenic. It is carcinogenic. It does cause reproductive effects in much the same way that we've seen in Chernobyl. In Chernobyl, the effects on these different endpoints look to be about 8 to 9 times larger for organisms living in nature versus those that are, tested in a laboratory setting. And so that's number one. And number two is that, absolutely, it's important to look at how the radionuclides themselves are transferred through the ecosystem, because that gives us a very good guesstimate at what the impacts might be to the top predators, the consumers, like the humans that are feeding on these different foodstuffs. But it also gives us a better idea of what the potential impacts for the ecosystem in this area will be in the long term. And again, it's critical that we develop these kinds of assays. So, my message to TEPCO and others has been, you need to get in there right now and start collecting all of these different organisms, from bacteria to the top predators, assaying, genotyping, conduct whole genome sequencing for as many of these organisms as you possibly can, because that is the most sensitive way to look for the genetic consequences. And this needs to be done before the dumping begins and then repeated as the dumping continues through time. And this will give us a really sensitive measure. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to note that since the dumping has already begun, and I don't know how quickly TEPCO is going to jump on this. Is there I know that you're doing a lot of research in Fukushima. Is there anyone that you know of that can undertake this in lieu of the fact that we can't rely on the private sector entity that may not want to or have the desire to execute exactly what you're suggesting?
There's probably 10,000 ecological geneticists in the world who could help conduct this kind of research. It would involve a collaboration with the oceanography people, the marine biology people, and the genomics labs that are popping up everywhere around the world, including in Japan, where they have excellent genomics capabilities at most of the major universities. And so it's just a question of funding. It's just a question of providing the seed funding to get this kind of work off the ground. At the moment, they've been very reluctant, and they were reluctant from the very beginning, from the very beginning of the accident in 2011. There were no incentives provided for any independent scientists to come in and conduct research. And as you mentioned, we were there. We were the first folks on the terrestrial side. I think there were people out on the marine side before we got there, but on the terrestrial side, we were the first international group to gain access to the most contaminated areas, and we documented very significant consequences for some aspects of the ecosystem, including the bird community, where we showed massive declines in abundance and biodiversity in the most radioactive areas. And it was striking. You just had to walk through a highly contaminated area. It was quiet. There were no butterflies flying. And you walk down the hill, 10 miles, 15 kilometers, and everything seemed quite normal, where it was much less contaminated.
Wow.
We repeated the kinds of surveillance measures at 400 different locations throughout this zone and over a four-year time period. And so highly replicated, but yet there was no incentives to do this work other than my own curiosity.
Amazing and alarming. But speaking of the work that you've done there and in Chernobyl, I want to note that every nuclear accident or incident is graded on the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale, or INES, a scale of 0 to 7, with 7 being the most dangerous and consequential. Of course, I'm not telling you this because I'm telling the audience this because this is something you know all too well. But in fact, there have only been, to my knowledge, 2 7s, Fukushima and Chernobyl, and you've studied both. So what lessons are there for us to learn from vis-a-vis these 2 mega disasters? What do they have in common? One was, I guess, terrestrial and atmospheric, and the other was marine and terrestrial. But tell us, in your words or in your observation, what we can learn and what the similarities are.
Absolutely, and there have been other accidents at nuclear facilities that were on par, but they were mostly at military installations, and we don't know much about them. But
and those are also 7s, you're saying?
Well, they would be considered that if they were scaled in that way, but they're different sorts of events, but they involve the releases. And of course, there was all the atomic bomb testing that was conducted during the Cold War era that left large amounts of radioactive contaminants scattered across the world, in fact. But getting back to Fukushima and Chernobyl. So Chernobyl, as mentioned, was the largest event in terms of the amount of radioactivity deposited across the landscape. Chernobyl is still highly radioactive in many parts of the zone. It's less radioactive than it was 37 years ago, but many parts of the zone still contain levels of radionuclides that would be considered dangerous for any kind of exposure. Parts of the Red Forest, for instance, an area that's sort of within 5 miles or so of the reactor, have levels of radiation 1 millisievert per hour in terms of the exposure rate, the dose rate, which would mean that you would get a whole year's worth of radiation in just a few hours. And certainly a week in that environment would lead to significant consequences. And so the organisms that live in those hot areas display all of the classic symptoms of radiation effects, including increased genetic damage, increased mutation rates, dramatic reductions in fertility and, in fact, sterility in many of the organisms in that area. Cataract in the eyes is sort of the classic symptom of radiation exposure, and reduced lifespan. And in fact, many of the species have gone locally extinct in these areas of highest contamination. But Fukushima, fortunately, was much less of a terrestrial event and more of a marine event. And so the contamination across Japan was dramatically lower, in many areas, probably, 10 to 100 times less radioactive than that seen in Chernobyl. And the area of contamination, again, 1/10 of the area most affected by Chernobyl. So it's a much smaller event. And this was just because of an accident or just by chance. The wind happened to be blowing mostly out to sea during the actual event. And so most of it was deposited onto the ocean or into the ocean and dispersed far and wide and diluted to a level that's still there, that's still real. It's below detection levels, given the limits of our own technology to measure it. But the similarities are, again, in the most contaminated areas, dramatic effects on some components of the ecosystem that persist to this day, although the areas are shrinking as expected, and nothing really surprising. Again, the effects on, say, bird populations were consistent with the conventional radioecological models that predict, a dose response relationship, and the patterns that we see in both places affect the same species in similar ways, and so we have replication of this unnatural experiment in both areas, and that again provides a lot of confidence that the effects that we've seen in this environment reflect, the effects of the contaminants, the radioactive pollutants, as it were.
Well, there's an interesting silver lining there, Tim, in that there's confidence in the predictive quality of what you expect to find, and it echoes what Bob said earlier about the predictive nature of what TEPCO was warned not to do, and how TEPCO was warned to build a wall, and that what they had was insufficient. So there's a confidence. What I'm getting out of this, in spite of the horror of the two incidents, is that there's a confidence that we should have in science, that the scientists were right in predicting that, and writ large, I think that offers us a window into the climate scenario, which is not really part of this discussion. But when scientists are warning about the dangers of climate change, and we're starting to see those dangers and those negative impacts, it gives us confidence to note that they're on the right track, and we should listen to them more. We should listen to you both more.
Indeed, I think that's a perfect example of a situation where, 30 years ago, the scientists were, raising the red flag, the warning flag, something's going on here. We're not entirely sure how big a problem it is. And then, organizations like the National Science Foundation listened to its constituents, the scientists in the US, for instance, and invested heavily to the tune of billions of dollars over several decades. And now we have all of the mechanisms in place, all of the tools in place to really document the cause and effect linkages between various components of the atmosphere and the climate and its impacts on the ecosystem. Again, there are many other examples, the ozone layer, and CFCs. I mentioned DDT and the loss of top predatory birds. Again, mercury and burning coal, acid rain and burning of coal. So, I think we need to be paying attention to these little red flags that are going up that the scientists are alerting us to.
Absolutely. Yeah. I also want to remind the audience, we've got about 20 minutes left. Well, we can go over, of course, but if you're in the audience and you have a question, please add your questions in the chat, and our host will be able to get them to us, and we'll be able to ask those questions of our experts here. Next question. The decommissioned Indian Point nuclear power plant in New York State, just 36 miles up the Hudson River from New York, where I am based, is also in the news of late, as the corporation that is overseeing this now decommissioned plant announced earlier this year that it planned horrifyingly on releasing or dumping more than 1 million gallons of contaminated water into the Hudson. There are 7 communities along the river that get their drinking water from the Hudson. There is an endangered species of sturgeon that spawns there. This is for both of you. Are there reasons to be alarmed over the possible dumping of this tritiated water in the Hudson? I know that we've similar as to what TEPCO is saying. Holtec, which is the company that is overseeing the decommissioned power plant here in what's called Indian Point, is assuring us that there's no dangers from tritiated water. But can you both weigh in on whether there are concerns about tritiated water being dumped?
Yeah, Tim, you want to go ahead?
Why do you go with you first? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, let me give it to Tim on the tritium, and I can talk about some of the other radionuclides and work that we've done. So Tim is the expert on tritium.
I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I have looked at a few papers recently. So, again, it's really the same answer. Nuclear power plants around the world have been producing vast quantities of tritium and, diluting them and dumping them into their cooling waters, and venting them through their stacks for decades. And, some reactor types are more polluting than others. And yet we still have not invested in the fundamental research needed to determine what the long-term consequences of that dumping might be. Now, clearly the critters are not dropping dead, as we discussed earlier. So it's not that it is incredibly toxic in these low concentrations, but we don't know what the long-term consequences will be or what the ecosystem level consequences will be. And so, yeah, I think it's a huge concern to be encouraging, supporting, allowing this kind of pollution to go on.
Yeah, just to add to that then, when we talk about tritium, the type of ionizing radiation it has is low-level beta, which are particles. There's a term when you look at radiation ecology, which is the RBE, the relative biological effectiveness. And just because something is considered a lower energy emitter doesn't mean that it's without consequences. And when you take a look at the effects of ionizing radiation, they come into basically two flavors. What are called the deterministic, which are the ones that you feel immediately. So when there's a large burst of ionizing radiation, skin burns and cell damage, things of that nature. And then they're the ones we call stochastic, and those are the cancers. And doing the epidemiology of cancer is nearly impossible. There's so many different ways of doing it. But we do know that as cells and DNA and RNA are being subjected to tritium and other low-level beta emitters, these beta particles can get lodged in tissue and continue to emit ionizing radiation. And these are a concern. And Tim is absolutely on target that there are lack of data points that we desperately need. And another one of our favorite saying is an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, meaning that if you don't know, you don't have data, you just don't know. And what we're often being told is, well, there's no proof that it's bad, so it must be good. And that's not in support of cautionary principle. And this is what's kind of disturbing to all of us and should be. Tim and I are categorized as scientists, but we're people, we're parents, spouses, we're humans. And there's a very important human element to it. We're not just looking at this as kind of a theoretical exercise. We're looking at the effects of these activities and these pollutants on ecosystems and the people who depend on them. And we know that human health and environmental health are inextricably linked. So this is not just a theoretical discussion. This is a reality of people living in a world where we have a variety of stressors that are going on all the time. And in the case of what's going on in Fukushima, I'm a marine biologist. This is what I do every day, is deal with what's going on. We're not painting on a blank canvas here. We have an ocean that's already in dire straits for the last century of human-induced disturbances, climate change, mercury pollution that Tim mentioned, plastics, nutrients, just go down the rogues gallery. And so this idea, well, it's just our radionuclides, makes no sense whatsoever. This is
Bob. I also appreciate the fact that I appreciate everything you're saying, but I also want to point out that that I so appreciate the fact that you both are scientists and you're both taking an unemotional approach to this and laying out the scientific cases for this, which is as alarming as anything else. I mean, I think we can often get swept up. This conversation was specifically intended not to be geopolitical, not to be political, but it was a science-based and your human emotions are absolutely well considered. But what I love about this conversation is we're making the scientific point, the scientific case for why this is problematic. Let me stop there just because I want to take some questions from the audience, and we'll go to Bart for the first one, and then we'll see what other questions the audience has cooked up for us.
beautifully you're presenting the science, because science is not difficult for people to understand when presented like Bob and Tim have done. I see that there's really a need for funding. So every grant writer in the country should start applying for Department of Energy funds. If they can find billions of dollars to support these nuclear power plants, then they certainly can find some money for really evidence-based research. My hat off to you for doing such a consequential job with your research. And also a mention of, it's nice that Woods Hole at MIT at Northeast is collaborating with the Scripps Institute of Oceanography down here in San Diego, where I'm based. I want to make certain that we have access to both of your labs. If there are any young students watching who want to do something extraordinary with their lives and with their careers, this is really a wide open opportunity for them to learn and discover. I guess my question to you is, given that a nuclear power plant needs to go through up to 1 billion gallons a day to cool, it's the most cumbersome way to boil water, but let's just say you have a nuclear power plant and it needs 1 billion gallons a day. For instance, at Diablo Canyon, the embrittled, aged Diablo Canyon, it's still operating. And then coming back to our own San Onofre nuclear power plant with 3.6 million pounds of the worst nuclear waste sitting on a beach 100 feet from the ocean. Bob, can you first tackle the dangers to the environment of the cooling water? And then second, maybe Tim, you can answer to the problem of terrestrial waste sitting on a fragile bluff in San Onofre.
Near a fault.
Sure. All right. So first and foremost, once you put something in the ocean, you're not going to get it back out again. And as we say, you just can't put the genie back in the bottle. So what we often hear is that, like in Fukushima and in the case of California, they will be monitoring to see if everything is okay. Monitoring does not prevent problems. It simply tells you when they occur. It's the equivalent of saying, I'm going to go ahead and smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day, but don't worry, I'll get an annual chest x-ray. Once your chest x-ray shows the lesion, it's not like I'm throwing my cigarettes away and everything will be fine. The way we describe it is brakes only work before you drive over a cliff, not on the way down. And these are the kinds of things we see constantly with statements like no measurable effect. I know how to set up an experiment, and we saw it at Fukushima, how to ensure you find no measurable effect by doing a very poorly designed experiment, or if your goal is to show no effect, to design your experiment to do exactly that. And that's the finding you're looking for. So as Tim pointed out, we have all of these very elegant and sophisticated tools now. Organisms are actually much more sensitive indicators of what's going on in the environment than most of the technologies we have today. And this is what's very concerning, is using the wrong tool for the wrong job. When you say no measurable effect, that means you have to look at the science that was done, the protocol, the resolution of the instrument or the organism, and the kinds of things Tim was talking about, DNA damage, RNA damage, protein damage. These are things we can measure at such fine levels before they become overriding to the organism. And so every time I read a radiologically environmental impact assessment, or even a regular environmental impact assessment, the industry is run by people who are hired to use science to obfuscate rather than clarify.
Thank you. Oh, Tim.
Yeah, that was that you hit it right on the head there, Bob. We see it over and over again. We've seen it in almost every environmental issue where science is employed to obfuscate rather than clarify, and often it's easy to tell who's who from based on where their funding comes from. And so it's very, very important, again, that independent scientists be employed for these kind of studies, and that the funding come through an independent organization like the National Science Foundation or the equivalent, or maybe the Samuel Morse Foundation. That would work too. But it's just it just needs to be conducted with rigor with the most sensitive tools possible. And yeah.
All right, here's a question from the audience. Is it true that 67% of TEPCO's ALPS treated Fukushima wastewater released into the Pacific Ocean exceeds the standards with a plethora of radioactive isotopes, more than just tritium?
I'll start with that, then toss it over to Tim. But we've been looking at the data that TEPCO provided and that we've been getting consistently. And the one consistency is the data are very inconsistent. And so they have this advanced liquid processing system. And when we look at ratios of things like strontium-90 to cesium-137, there are certain ratios that you would expect in a nuclear power plant or in a damaged one like this. And we've seen numbers that were 8,000 to 16,000 fold different than what was expected. And we asked for explanations for that. We were getting everything except the answers we were looking for. And this gets back to the idea. There are 62 radionuclides that have not been adequately sampled. Tritium is one of the ones that both Tim and I have talked about, but tritium is not the one that worries me as much as the cesium-137, the strontium-90, cobalt-60. There's a rogues gallery of at least a dozen to 20 radionuclides, where when you look at the data that TEPCO has presented on they do exceed the levels, and they keep saying, well, if we have to run the water through one time or 300 times, we'll keep doing it. But what's really disturbing to me is the lack of scientific rigor when we ask what's in the tanks, how many tanks have you sampled? There's a very, very easy tool we use called the power analysis. How many samples would you need to take from how many tanks, how often, to be able to have a good picture of what's there? And when I asked one of the Japanese scientists flat out, can you just show us your analyses? Can you show us the power analysis so we can have some confidence in your numbers of what's there and what's coming out? And he shook his head, said, no, we never did it. And so their argument was, we don't really care what's in the tanks. We only care what we're dumping in the ocean. But this is QA/QC 101. Every student in my laboratory, even those doing a science fair project in 7th or 8th grade, knows how to run a power analysis for being able to do statistics that give you confidence. And this is one of our main questions. We are very lack confidence in the numbers we're seeing. I'm not sure about the 67%, but we see a number of anomalies in the data that do not give us confidence that this is working at the level that is ready for prime time. And that's why we said, at very least, it's premature to do the dumping. At very worst, it's ill-advised across the board, which is still my position.
Tim, anything to add on that?
No, I think that captures it very, very well. And it's just really concerning that we have little confidence in the data that's being presented, and almost no confidence in the so-called experiments designed to assess the impacts of the release of these radionuclides. Clearly the IAEA or some other organization needs to be a little bit more aggressive in implementing common sense approaches to dealing with this problem.
Well, this webinar is so informative to me because I had concerns previously, but I figured that if they're dumping it, even though there are other countries are upset by it, someone must know something. And it's just concerning that you two, who are so well versed in this and so expert in dealing with scale 7 disasters like this, and know the outcomes and know the science to track it. I feel like we need to shout from the mountaintops that that everyone needs to watch this and take action. The next question from the audience is, I guess this is to Bob. Can you share a link after the webinar to TEPCO's reasons for dismissing storage on site and/or the concrete proposal? And is it possible to determine yet whether we will see a court ruling or other action that could potentially order Japan to suspend the release until certain issues are resolved? That's more of a political question, but Bob, do you have any information on that?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'll go ahead and send you some links afterwards that you can post and share with other people. On the issue of the legal approach, unfortunately, as a scientist, I would love to say that the science is going to change the pathway, but it's not. The science can be the foundation, but it's going to end up having to go to legal settlement somehow. There is what's called an International Tribunal for Law of the Sea, and there has been a formal complaint filed by a group of lawyers from Europe using that to support stakeholders in the Pacific. We know that there's interest from the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea, and if they do make a ruling, they could require Japan to suspend any further discharge until this is resolved. It would probably buy a couple of years. Interestingly enough, when Tim mentioned the DDT, one of the lawyers who actually began the Environmental Defense Fund years ago contacted us as well. He took Monsanto to court over DDT, and he took the U.S. government to court over Agent Orange. It wasn't a tort, meaning that they weren't trying to get a financial settlement. They went after discovery to get the documents to show what was going on. Unfortunately, I think that's probably the root. So the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea is considering a formal complaint, and there may be a couple of other legal cases filed would be able to challenge the Japanese government on what they're doing. It's interesting, in June of this year, 193 nations signed on to what we call the BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions. That's also called the High Seas Treaty. And it specifically talks about ocean water quality throughout the region, beyond the boundaries of any nation. The ink is hardly dry on this treaty, and already Japan is violating the spirit of this law. There's the United Nations Convention for Law of the Sea, Precautionary Principle. There's two other legal documents, the London Protocol and the London Convention. And I'm not a lawyer, but in discussing this with lawyers as well, there are a lot of questions. Just to put it in perspective, if Japan were to put the exact same water onto a tanker and release it at the exact same spot, it would be illegal under the United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea. They're claiming because it's coming out of a pipe from land, it's not dumping, it's a discharge. And for the animals and the people in the Pacific, no difference, but it's the fine elements of law, which we all can appreciate. But unfortunately, I think it's going to take public pressure and legal action if there's going to be any difference in the way things are going.
All right. So for the next episode, we'll have to get lawyers on here to talk about the fine print there. I think we have time for one more question. Oh, go ahead, Bart.
Yeah, I mean, that was so eloquently answered, Bob. We have San Onofre draining water. They drain billions of gallons into the Pacific Ocean. Can you talk to that? Which probably is similarly what Diablo Canyon has now as an operating power plant, or just the shuttered dump site, nuclear waste dump site at San Onofre. Can you talk to the fact of the waters off the Pacific Ocean?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with those sites. So since I really don't know much about them, I'd prefer not to talk about things for which I don't have adequate knowledge.
But just the general coastline as opposed to a bay or okay.
Well, we talk about what we call receiving water characteristics. Residence time makes a big difference, that if you have an enclosed bay, there's a greater chance to do the things that both Tim and I have talked about. The more exposure organisms have, the more time they're exposed, the greater their ability for uptake, accumulation, and magnification. Again, the dilution factor, there is no question a dilution factor, but this is where chemistry and biology collide. The dilution is a chemical process, the accumulation is a biological process. The physicists and chemists that are always on our case saying, well, the ocean is big, no big deal. Yeah, but there's a lot of life in the ocean, so it is a big deal. And so it's the same thing, whether it's in Japan or California, same mechanisms work, the same physics, the same chemistry, and same biology, and the same need to be able to use the precautionary principle to act in a responsible fashion. And because this is the UN Ocean Decade, and we have these new rules, everyone recognizes that the health of the ocean is compromised. The idea that we can continue to use the ocean as a dumping ground for everything we don't want on land is simply non-sustainable.
I think we're coming up on time, but let me ask both panelists if they have any closing thoughts, closing remarks, anything they thought they want, anything that we want to get off their chest that weren't asked. And as a side note, there's so many questions I wanted to ask, particularly Tim, about the feral dogs of Chernobyl, which is just merits its own conversation later. So the fascinating research you're doing there. But let's because of time, let's go to some closing remarks if either of you have any. Tim, let's start with you.
Or go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing up the dog project. And, a few years ago, I'd been working in Chernobyl for, 17 or 18 years. And a friend of mine alerted me, she happens to have written a book on Chernobyl, Kate Brown, the historian at MIT, who's written a lot about Chernobyl over the years. And she alerted me to the fact that there was this animal control program going on in Chernobyl. The dogs had taken over the power plant. And so I hopped on board and started getting, DNA samples and microbiome samples and fur samples from these dogs that have been living. They're actually, what we found out this year was that they are the descendants of the pets that were left behind by the inhabitants 37 plus years ago. And so right now, in collaboration with Elaine Ostrander at the NIH, National Academy of Science member, a renowned cancer geneticist, we are looking at the DNA and, with great deal. One of my PhD students, Gabby Spatola, has been doing incredible work, again, sequencing the entire genomes, and we'll have an answer for you as to exactly how much genetic damage these dogs have experienced. But again,
So fascinating.
The closing remark is, there's no such thing as too much data. There's no such thing as too much information. And clearly it really is a shame that we don't have a lot more, given that we've been in this nuclear era since 1945, right? And still we have so many unanswered questions. And we just need to move forward.
Yeah, my closing comments believe that, challenges are also opportunities. And our hearts go out to the people of Japan. When the earthquake hit and the damage, lives were lost, it was truly a tragedy. But it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for Japan, TEPCO, and basically for the world to be able to learn from this mistake. And as the saying goes, those who ignore history are forced to repeat it. We have a unique opportunity to look at this disaster as an opportunity to improve the way in which future problems are handled in the nuclear industry. And I think the timing is really important, that this is not the first nuclear disaster, nor will it be the end. Now there's a big push to put on nuclear power and to put more nuclear power plants online. And how can anyone have confidence in the industry if their solution is still, when things go wrong, just dump it in the ocean and turn your way and not worry about it? We're really concerned. And my view is we should take this opportunity to work with Japan, to work with TEPCO, to bring the best minds together. Tim spoke to some of them and himself as well, to be able to work together as a scientific community to come up with better ways and use this tragedy as the ultimate opportunity for Japan to be a world leader in developing and applying the technology to ensure that things like this, if they do happen, and they will, do not have environmental consequences, do not affect environmental health, nor the health of the people who depend on the environment.
Well, thank you, doctors, both of you, for that insightful discussion and for bringing your expertise here today. You both are doing such important research with consequences that seem bound to have more impact on our future than ever before. So thank you again. That concludes the program today. To rewatch the webinar or to see its transcript next week, go to the Samuel Lawrence Foundation website. The website is samuellawrencefoundation.org. Thank you so much to Beyond Nuclear, Sierra Club Canada, and Blue Planet Alliance, our presenting sponsors, as well as Brooklyn Story Lab, my own company. To learn more about the critical work all the participating parties are doing to advance renewable energy and other sustainable initiatives, and to stay informed about upcoming events and important initiatives, sign up for the newsletters of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation. And again, you can use the QR code on the screen, or for the Brooklyn Story Lab's newsletter, which is brooklynstorylab.net. Also, make sure you join us for the next Samuel Lawrence Foundation First Friday series on November 3rd. Thank you so much, and goodbye.